Chapter 1. It was not a good beginning. In the 1830s, every English town had a workhouse. This was a place where poor people lived. They had no jobs, so the government gave them a place to work and sleep and food to eat. These were not nice places. The government did not want people to become lazy, so they made the workhouses as uncomfortable as possible. They gave the poor people uniforms to wear, as they did to prisoners. The food was terrible. The rooms were in bad condition. Many people got sick and died there. Nobody wanted to live there. Oliver was born in a workhouse. Nobody knew who his father was, and his mother died as soon as Oliver was born. It was not a good beginning. Nobody knew Oliver's mother's name. Nobody even knew where she came from. Somebody found her lying in the street the day before Oliver's birth and brought her to the workhouse. They knew that she came from far away because her feet were bleeding after her long walk. After Oliver was born, the doctor put on his hat and went home to have dinner. "Don't call me if the boy is sick," he told the nurse. "He probably will be sick, but just give him some gruel to eat." The nurse wrapped Oliver in a piece of cloth. Oliver cried. He cried loudly, but he should have cried even louder. Oliver spent the first 9 years of his life with Mrs. Mann. The government paid Mrs. Mann to look after children like Oliver. She looked after about 20 or 30 children like him. She knew exactly what the children needed, but she also knew exactly what she needed. As a result, she spent most of the money on herself. The children were always hungry and sometimes they starved to death. Sometimes one would fall in the fire while Mrs. Mann was not looking or die of cold in the winter. Somehow, Oliver stayed alive. On his 9th birthday, Oliver was small, thin, and pale. He and 2 other boys told Mrs. Mann that they were hungry. Mrs. Mann said they were not hungry. She hit them and locked all 3 of them in the cellar. This was their punishment for complaining. When Mrs. Mann looked out of the window, she was surprised to see the beadle at the gate, trying to get in. The beadle was an officer from the government. He thought he was an important officer. He was very fat, but he had a beautiful uniform, which made him feel even more important. When Mrs. Mann saw him, she quickly told her helper to get the 3 boys out of the cellar and clean their faces and hands. She pretended she was very pleased to see the beadle, whose name was Mr. Bumble, and gave him a glass of gin to drink. Mr. Bumble told Mrs. Mann that he was going to take Oliver away because he was now 9 years old. "We have never been able to find out anything about his father or mother," he said. "We don't even know their names. Oliver will work in the workhouse and earn his gruel." Mrs. Mann was surprised that nobody knew who Oliver's parents were and wondered how he got a name. "I gave it to him," said the beadle. "I made it up myself." Mrs. Mann brought Oliver to the beadle. "Would you like to come with me, Oliver?" asked Mr. Bumble. Oliver would like to go anywhere with anyone if it meant getting away from Mrs. Mann, but he didn't say that. He knew he had to pretend that he loved Mrs. Mann, so he cried. It was not difficult to cry because he was so hungry and sad. Mr. Bumble let him out of the house, and poor Oliver cried even more because he really was sad to leave the other children. They were his only friends. When they arrived at the workhouse, the beadle discovered that the board of the workhouse was meeting. They wanted to see Oliver and speak to him. Oliver did not know what the board was and didn't dare to ask. He was afraid. Mr. Bumble hit him with his stick to hurry him up, and took him to the boardroom. There, Oliver found 8 or 10 fat gentlemen sitting around a large table. One of the chairs was higher than the others, and the man in it was fatter than the others. "What's your name, boy?" asked the fat gentleman. Oliver was frightened and spoke very quietly. Mr. Bumble hit him again, and this made him cry, although it was not a very hard hit. The fat man told him that he was an orphan. "What's that?" asked Oliver. "It means you have no father or mother," said the fat man. "It means that other people like us are paying for your food and clothes. I hope you are thankful." "Why are you crying?" asked one of the other gentlemen. Oliver could not answer. "We are going to educate you and teach you to work," said the fat man. "Tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, you will begin to pick oakum." Oliver didn't know what this was, but he soon found out. He had to pull old ropes apart. People in jail or in workhouses often did this hard and boring work. That night, he cried in his hard bed until he fell asleep. The board, meanwhile, decided that people in workhouses were getting too much food. They thought too many people wanted to be in the workhouses to get food. They decided to give them less food, so that they would leave the workhouse and find jobs. Many people died of hunger, but the board was happy. Giving the people less food saved money. Having fewer people in the workhouse saved even more money. The boys in the workhouse had their meals in a large stone hall. They each had a small bowl and a spoon. They brought their bowl to the front of the hall, and the master filled it with gruel. They brought their bowls back to the table and sat down to eat the gruel. The bowls never had to be washed because the boys ate the gruel until there was not one drop left. Then they licked their fingers to get any gruel that might be on them. They also licked their spoons clean, but they were still hungry. After 3 months, one of the bigger boys said to the others that he was so hungry he might eat one of the smaller boys. They were all afraid of him and decided to ask the master for more gruel. Who would dare to ask? They chose Oliver. The next day, after they ate their gruel and were still hungry, Oliver went to the master. "Please, sir, I want some more," he said. The master could not believe his ears. Oliver had to say it again. The master hit him and called for the beadle. The beadle went to the board to tell them what had happened. Oliver Twist had asked for more. The board could not believe their ears either. The beadle had to say it again. The board decided that Oliver was too much trouble. He was sure to end up in jail. They put him in a cold, dark room by himself and would not allow the other boys to talk to him. At mealtimes, they brought Oliver to the dining hall and hit him there in front of the other boys. This would show them what happened to boys who asked for more. The board put a notice on the gate of the workhouse. The notice said that they would give £5 to anyone who would take Oliver as an apprentice for a job. The first person to ask about Oliver was a chimney sweep who owed his landlord £5. Being a chimney sweep was a dangerous job, and many boys died. The board agreed to give the sweep £3, and he agreed to take Oliver. The board took Oliver to the judge, who had to sign the contract. The contract would last for 7 years. The judge saw that Oliver was very afraid of the chimney sweep. He refused to sign the papers. He ordered the board to take Oliver back to the workhouse and look after him. The next person to ask for Oliver was the undertaker, whose name was Mr. Sowerberry. This time the board gave Oliver to the undertaker on trial. They did not need the judge's agreement for that. The beadle took Oliver to the undertaker's house. Mr. Sowerberry called his wife to look at the boy. She thought Oliver was small and useless and sent him to the kitchen. The undertaker's dog had left some food in its bowl, and this became Oliver's dinner. When he had eaten it all, Mrs. Sowerberry took him to his bed, which was in a room full of coffins. Chapter 2. It was a long way. Oliver felt very afraid and alone when he got into his bed in the room of coffins. He wished that his bed was a coffin and he could sleep forever. Then he would never be hungry again. He got into his bed and slept. In the morning he woke up because someone was kicking the door and shouting. He got up to open the door. The shouter was Noah Claypole, a boy who was a few years older than Oliver and much bigger. He made fun of Oliver and hit him for being lazy. Noah was a charity boy. This meant that he was very poor and went to a charity school for poor children. Everybody made fun of Noah because his parents were poor. Oliver was even poorer. Noah was happy to have somebody poor to tease. He told Oliver what to do, and did nothing himself. He laughed at Oliver all the time. His friend Charlotte, who worked in the kitchen, laughed at Oliver too. Oliver had to help make the coffins. When he had been there about a month, Mr. Sowerberry began to take him along to funerals. Poor people in England often starved to death in those days, and Oliver saw some really terrible things. Some of the people lived in dirty houses, with dirty clothes and no food. There was no medicine for people who had no money, so they just got sick and died. One man went out to beg for food for his starving wife. Begging was against the law, and he was put in jail. When he came out, his wife was very sick, and a few days later she died. Oliver did not like the funerals. Noah Claypole was annoyed because Mr. Sowerberry took Oliver to the funerals. He began to tease Oliver more and more. One day, he said some bad things about Oliver's mother. Oliver got very angry and hit Noah. He was not afraid, even though Noah was much bigger than he. Noah fell down and began to cry. He shouted for help. Charlotte came into the room and saw Noah on the ground. She screamed and hit Oliver with her fist. Mrs. Sowerberry came in and saw Charlotte hitting Oliver. "He was trying to murder Noah!" shouted Charlotte. Mrs. Sowerberry held on to Oliver so that Charlotte could hit him more easily. Then Noah got up and started to hit Oliver too. Mrs. Sowerberry held on to Oliver with one hand and scratched his face with the other. They dragged Oliver to the cellar and locked him in. Mr. Sowerberry was not home, and they didn't know what to do next. Oliver kicked at the cellar door, and Mrs. Sowerberry began to cry and ordered Noah to run to Mr. Bumble and ask him to come. Noah ran as fast as he could. Mr. Bumble was talking to a member of the board. Noah told them that Oliver tried to murder him, then Charlotte, and then Mrs. Sowerberry. He could hardly breathe, and he held different parts of his body to show how hurt he was. "He said he wanted to kill the master too," gasped Noah. "I always said that he would end up in jail," said the member of the board. "Perhaps they'll even hang him." He told Mr. Bumble to flog Oliver. "Make sure you do a good job," he said, as Noah and Mr. Bumble hurried toward the undertaker's house. Mr. Bumble spoke to Oliver through the cellar door. "Do you know who this is?" he asked. "Yes," said Oliver. "Aren't you afraid?" asked the beetle. "No," said Oliver, and began to kick the door again. Mr. Bumble was very surprised. People were always afraid of him. Mrs. Sowerberry thought Oliver must be mad. "No," said the beetle. "It is meat. You gave him too much good food, and now he thinks he is someone. I think we should keep him in the cellar for a few days. We will take him out and flog him when he is quieter." Mr. Sowerberry came home and heard what happened. He dragged Oliver out of the cellar and hit him. Oliver told him that Noah had said bad things about his mother. Mrs. Sowerberry said that Noah only told the truth. Oliver called Mrs. Sowerberry a liar, and she started to cry. Mr. Sowerberry hit Oliver again and locked him in the kitchen, where he stayed for the rest of the day until bedtime. Oliver did not sleep that night. He wrapped his clothes in a piece of cloth. He had a shirt and 2 pairs of stockings. He also had a piece of bread and 1 penny that Mr. Sowerberry gave him a long time ago. That was all he had. Very early the next morning, he looked outside. It was just beginning to get light. He picked up his small bundle, opened the door, and went out. He looked to the right and to the left. He began to walk. He walked quickly. He came to a path. This led him past Mrs. Mann's house. As he passed the house, he saw one of his old friends, Dick, in the garden. Nobody else was up yet, and the 2 friends said goodbye. Dick told Oliver that the doctor said he would not live much longer. Oliver was sad. He told Dick that he would get better. At 8 o'clock that morning, Oliver sat down to rest. He had walked 5 miles. He thought about what he would do. A notice told him that London was 70 miles away. Nobody would ever find him there, he decided. He began to walk. It was a long way. He walked 20 miles that day. The only food he had was his piece of bread. He got some water from houses along the way. He slept outside that night and woke up very cold and stiff. He used his penny to buy some bread and walked on. He walked only 12 miles that day. His feet and legs hurt. He slept outside again. The next morning, he could hardly crawl. He begged for money and food, but very few people would give him anything. One man gave him some bread and cheese, and an old woman gave him some food and spoke kindly to him. He went on like this for 7 days. Early on the 7th day, he limped into a town called Barnet. His feet were bleeding, and he was very dirty and tired. He sat down to rest. The people in Barnet began to wake up and walk along the street. Nobody took any notice of Oliver. But after a while, he saw a boy of about his own age looking at him. He looked at the boy. The boy said hello. This boy was not poor like Oliver. He wasn't rich either. He was dressed very strangely, thought Oliver. The boy asked Oliver what he was doing. Oliver told him he was hungry and tired. "I've walked a long way," he said. "I've been walking for 7 days." The other boy took him to a shop and bought him some food and drink, and they had a meal together. "Going to London?" asked the boy. "Yes," answered Oliver. "Got a place to stay?" "No." "Any money?" "No." "Don't worry," said the boy. "Come with me. I know someone who will give you a place to sleep." The boy told Oliver that his name was Jack Dawkins, but people called him the Artful Dodger. Oliver didn't know what it meant, but went with him anyway, and they walked to London together. The Dodger led him through the streets. The houses on the streets were old and broken, and the streets were dirty and muddy. There were lots of poor children wearing rags, and people were fighting and shouting inside the houses. It was not a nice place. Oliver thought he should run away, but the Dodger opened a door and pushed him into a house. The stairs inside the house were broken, and the two boys climbed up them carefully. They went into a room that was black with dirt. An old man with red hair was cooking some food over a fire. He looked terrible. There were a lot of handkerchiefs hanging on a rope to dry. 4 or 5 boys sat around a table, talking and drinking. They were all younger than the Dodger. The Artful Dodger took him to the old man. "This is Fagin," said the Dodger. "Fagin, this is my friend Oliver Twist." "I'm very pleased to meet you," said Fagin. "I hope we will be good friends." The other boys all came to say hello to Oliver. They gave him some food and a glass of gin to drink. Oliver ate and drank. It made him feel sleepy. Someone lifted him up and put him on one of the beds in the room, and he was soon asleep. Chapter 3. He seemed to have a lot of pockets. Oliver woke very late the next morning, after a long, deep sleep. The only person in the room was Fagin, who was making some tea at the fire. Oliver was still half asleep, but he saw Fagin go to the door and lock it. Then he saw him take a small box out of a hiding place in the floor. He took out a beautiful watch and some jewels and looked at them. Then Fagin noticed that Oliver was awake, and he became very angry. "What did you see?" he shouted. Oliver told him. Fagin stopped being angry. He explained that he was saving the jewels because he would need them when he was old. The Artful Dodger returned with one of the other boys. His name was Charlie Bates. Fagin asked the 2 boys what they had. The Artful Dodger gave him 2 wallets, and Charlie Bates gave him 4 handkerchiefs. Oliver thought that the 2 boys made these things. Fagin asked Oliver if he would like to learn how to make handkerchiefs and wallets as quickly as the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates. Charlie Bates laughed very loudly. Oliver said he would. Charlie Bates laughed even louder. After breakfast, the 2 boys and Fagin played a game. Fagin walked around the room. He pretended he was in the street. He stopped to look in shop windows. The 2 boys tried to take things from his pockets. If Fagin felt them doing it, he would shout. They played this game for a while. Then 2 older girls came into the room. Their names were Bet and Nancy. Fagin gave the boys some money, and they left with the 2 girls. Fagin asked Oliver to try and take a wallet from his coat pocket. Oliver copied what the Artful Dodger did. Fagin was very pleased. He told Oliver to always do what the Artful Dodger told him to do, and one day he would be a great man. Then he showed Oliver how to take the sewn initials out of handkerchiefs. Oliver did this for many days. The boys kept bringing more handkerchiefs. Fagin and the boys played the same game every morning when the boys returned with the wallets and handkerchiefs. Sometimes the boys came back with nothing. When that happened, Fagin was angry and would not allow them to have dinner. Oliver asked to go out with the boys, and one day, at last, Fagin agreed. There were no handkerchiefs to fix, and Fagin said Oliver could go out with the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates. They walked along the streets, but the boys did not hurry. Oliver was surprised when he saw Charlie Bates take apples and oranges from the shops along the way and put them into his pockets. He seemed to have a lot of pockets. Oliver didn't like it, and was about to go back to Fagin when the Artful Dodger suddenly stopped and put his finger in front of his mouth. "What's wrong?" asked Oliver. "Can you see that old man at the bookshop?" asked the Artful Dodger. Oliver saw an elderly gentleman standing outside the bookshop. He was reading a book. "He'll do," said the Artful Dodger. Charlie Bates agreed, and the two boys began to walk toward the man. Oliver walked behind them. He didn't know what to do. Then he saw the Artful Dodger put his hand in the gentleman's pocket, take out a handkerchief, and give it to Charlie Bates. The two boys ran around the corner as quickly as they could. Suddenly, Oliver understood everything. He understood about the handkerchiefs in the room, the games that Fagin played with the boys, and the jewels in the box. He turned and ran. The old gentleman noticed that his handkerchief was not in his pocket. He saw Oliver running away. "Stop, thief!" he shouted and began to run after Oliver. Everyone stopped to look. Other people began to shout too. The Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates also began to shout and run after Oliver. "Stop, thief!" they shouted. Oliver ran as fast as he could, but it was not fast enough. A man caught him. The two boys disappeared. The old gentleman came running up. "I'm not sure that he took it," he said. It was too late. A police officer took Oliver to the judge. The judge was an irritable man who shouted at the old gentleman and also at Oliver. "What is your name?" he shouted at Oliver. Oliver couldn't speak, so a court officer told the judge his name was Tom White. The judge asked some other questions, but Oliver could not make a noise. He felt very sick. The judge said Oliver had to work hard in jail for 3 months. Before they could take him away, however, Oliver fainted, and somebody carried him out. Another gentleman came into the court and told the judge that he was the bookseller, and that he saw 2 other boys take the handkerchief. He knew that Oliver did not take it. The judge agreed and said Oliver was allowed to leave. The man who was reading outside the bookshop was Mr. Brownlow. He left the court and found Oliver lying on his back in the street, hardly able to breathe. Mr. Brownlow called a carriage and took Oliver to his own house. Oliver was sick for many days. He did not know what was happening around him. He could not speak or eat, and hardly drank. The servants in Mr. Brownlow's house looked after Oliver. One day, finally, he spoke. "Where am I?" he asked. Immediately, a woman came to his bed. She was very kind and told him he must be quiet, or he would be sick again. She told him that her name was Mrs. Bedwin, and she would look after him. A little while later, a doctor came to see Oliver. "You must be hungry," said the doctor. "No," said Oliver. "He's not hungry," said the doctor. "You must want to sleep," he said. "No," said Oliver. "Then you are not thirsty either," said the doctor. "Yes, I am," said Oliver. The doctor spoke to Mrs. Bedwin. "Give him some tea," he said, "and make sure that he is not too hot or too cold." A few days later, Oliver could sit up in bed, although he still could not walk. Mrs. Bedwin took him downstairs to her room and sat him by the fire. She gave him some food. He thought it was the best food he had ever eaten. Oliver saw a picture on the wall and could not stop looking at it. It was a picture of a pretty lady, and Oliver thought that she wanted to speak to him. When he told Mrs. Bedwin this, she moved his chair so that he could not see it. Oliver asked her who it was, but Mrs. Bedwin did not know. Then Mr. Brownlow came in to see him. Poor boy, he said when he saw Oliver. "Have you given him some food, Mrs. Bedwin?" he asked. Mrs. Bedwin told him she had. "Did you like the food, Tom?" asked Mr. Brownlow. "Yes, I did. But my name is not Tom. It is Oliver Twist." "Why did you tell the judge your name was Tom White?" asked Mr. Brownlow. "I didn't tell him that," answered Oliver. "Are you angry with me?" he asked. "No, no," said Mr. Brownlow. Then he exclaimed, "What's this? Mrs. Bedwin, look at this." He pointed at the picture above Oliver's head. Oliver was a copy of the lady in the picture. The head, the eyes, the nose, and the mouth were exactly the same. Oliver did not know why Mr. Brownlow was so surprised because the exclamation made him faint again. The Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates made sure that the police did not catch them. Then they ran back toward Fagin's house. They were almost there when Charlie Bates began to laugh. "What's funny?" asked the Artful Dodger. "It was so funny to see him run," said Charlie Bates. "And we were running after him shouting, 'Stop thief!' It was very funny." The Artful Dodger did not laugh. "What will Fagin say?" he said. The two boys got to the house and went in. Fagin saw that there were only two boys. "Where's the third one?" he wondered. Chapter 4. Where's Oliver? "Where's Oliver?" asked Fagin. The two boys looked at each other. When they told him that the police had taken Oliver, he was very, very angry. He threw a cup of cold tea at Charlie Bates. Just then, a large man came in through the door, and some of the tea spilled on him. He was annoyed. This man was Bill Sikes, and he was a criminal. He had a dog with him, but he was very cruel to the dog. He kicked it and shouted at it all the time. The dog laid down in a corner of the room. The Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates explained what had happened to Oliver. Fagin was worried. "He might tell the police about us," he said. Sikes thought this was funny. "You might be in trouble," he said, smiling. "If I am in trouble, we are all in trouble," said Fagin, "and it will be worse for you than for me." Sikes stopped smiling. Everyone sat quietly for a few minutes. Finally, Sikes spoke. "We must find out what happened to him." They all agreed, but none of them dared to go to the police station or talk to a police officer. They solved this problem when Bet and Nancy came in. They persuaded Nancy to go. She didn't want to go, but Sikes threatened her until she agreed. They gave her a white dress and a basket. Then they put a bonnet on her head and gave her a key to carry to make her look respectable. They told her to pretend that she was searching for her brother Oliver. She went to the police station. There she found out that the gentleman had taken Oliver to his own home. "My poor brother," cried Nancy. "Where does the gentleman live?" "I don't know the address," said the police officer, "but I heard him tell the carriage driver to go to Pentonville." As soon as Sikes heard Nancy's story, he called his dog, put on his hat, and left. He didn't even say goodbye. Fagin told the boys to leave immediately. "You know where to go," he said. "The other place." The boys left. Fagin locked the door and took the box from its hiding place. He took everything out of it and put them in his pockets. Then he left too. Oliver soon recovered from his faint. Mr. Brownlow and Mrs. Bedwin did not talk about the picture to him. They did not want him to faint again. The next day he came down to the room. He was disappointed when he saw that the picture was not there. "We took it away," said Mrs. Bedwin. "You can see it again when you are better." Oliver slowly got stronger. When he was able to dress himself again, Mr. Brownlow bought new clothes for him. Mrs. Bedwin sold his old clothes to an old man in the street. Oliver gave the money to a servant. He was very pleased to see the clothes go. He thought that he would never wear them again. About a week later, Mr. Brownlow called Oliver to come to his study. Oliver was very interested in all the books in the room. He said he would like to read them. "I want you to listen to me," said Mr. Brownlow. He was kind but serious. Oliver thought that Mr. Brownlow was going to send him away and begged him to let him stay. "I will never send you away unless you give me a good reason to," said Mr. Brownlow. "I never will, sir," said Oliver. "Tell me your story, Oliver," said Mr. Brownlow. Before Oliver could start, however, there was a knock on the door. It was Mr. Grimwig. Mr. Grimwig was Mr. Brownlow's friend, and although he liked to argue, he was a good man. Mr. Brownlow sent Oliver downstairs to tell Mrs. Bedwin that they were ready for tea. "So, that is the boy, is it?" said Grimwig. "Yes, a good-looking boy, don't you think?" said Mr. Brownlow. "I don't know," replied Grimwig. He wanted to argue. "You don't know anything about him. Where does he come from? Who is he? What is he? Are you sure he will not steal from you at night?" Mr. Grimwig did not think that Oliver would do that, but he wanted to argue with his friend. When they had finished drinking their tea, he asked, "When are you going to hear his story?" "Tomorrow," replied Mr. Brownlow. "Oliver, come to me tomorrow at 10 o'clock." Oliver promised he would. "He won't come to you," argued Mr. Grimwig. "He will," answered Mr. Brownlow. "I believe him." "He's lying to you," argued Mr. Grimwig. "We shall see," said Mr. Brownlow. "Yes, we shall see," said Mr. Grimwig. Just then, a messenger arrived. He took some books from the bookshop, and Mrs. Bedwin brought them to the gentleman. Mr. Brownlow had to return some other books to the bookshop, but the messenger had not waited. "Ask Oliver to return the books," said Mr. Grimwig. "Or don't you trust him?" Mr. Brownlow was annoyed with his friend. "Of course I trust him." He called Oliver and gave him the books and a £5 note, telling him to take them to the bookseller. Oliver was very pleased to be useful. The gentleman explained where the shop was, and he set off with the parcel of books and £5 in his pocket. "He will return in 20 minutes," said Mr. Brownlow. "He will never return," said his friend. "He will." "He won't." Mr. Brownlow put his watch on the table, and the two friends waited. Oliver walked happily toward the bookshop. He went into the wrong street and was about to turn around when a woman wearing a white dress and carrying a basket suddenly took hold of him. "My brother!" she screamed. "Don't!" said Oliver. "Who are you? Why did you stop me?" "My brother! My brother!" she cried. "Come home, brother Oliver. I have found you." Other people came up to see what the noise was. She explained to them that Oliver was her brother who ran away from home a month ago. Everyone told him to go with his sister. Suddenly, Oliver recognized the lady. "It's Nancy," he exclaimed. "You see, he knows my name. Come home, Oliver," said Nancy. A man with a white dog came out of a shop and grabbed Oliver. He took the books and hit Oliver on the head. He dragged Oliver along the street. It was growing dark. The two gentlemen sat with the watch on the table while Oliver met all his old friends again. Fagin was very pleased to see him. The Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates were also happy, and they laughed to see him so well dressed. Then they found the £5 in his pocket. Fagin and Sikes argued about the money. Sikes said he would take Oliver back if Fagin didn't let him have the money. Fagin gave it to him. Oliver was very upset. "Send the books and the money back," he begged. "He will think I stole them. Keep me, but send the books back." "That's right," said Fagin, smiling. "They will think you stole them. It couldn't be better." Oliver tried to escape and ran out through the door, but they quickly caught him. Fagin was going to hit Oliver with a stick, but Nancy stopped him. She took the stick and threw it in the fire. She was very angry and said that she was sorry that she had caught Oliver. Sikes and Fagin argued with her. Finally, she fainted, and they put her in a bed. They took Oliver to another room and made him put on the very same clothes that he had sold. The man who had bought them showed them to Fagin, and this helped Fagin find out where Oliver was staying. Chapter 5. You Cannot Help Yourself. Mr. Bumble went to visit Mrs. Mann. He told her that he was going to London. He felt very important. The board chose him to go. He had to speak to a judge about 2 of the poor people in the workhouse. He felt even more important than usual. "How are the children?" he asked. 2 children died last week," replied Mrs. Mann. "And little Dick is still sick. The others are well." Mr. Bumble called Dick and told him to get better and stop being lazy. Dick said he wanted to write a letter to Oliver. He wanted to tell him how often he thought of him walking in the dark with nobody to help him. "What a bad boy you are," said Mrs. Mann. "What a bad boy Oliver is," said the beadle. Dick was locked in the cellar, and Mr. Bumble went back to the workhouse. The next day, he went to London in a carriage. When he arrived, he had a meal and then sat down to read the paper. The first thing he saw in the paper was this: £5 reward. A young boy named Oliver Twist disappeared from his home in Pentonville last Thursday. Someone may have taken him, or he may have run away. I will give £5 to anyone who can tell me where he is, or tell me anything about his life. The notice ended with Mr. Brownlow's name and address. Mr. Bumble read this notice 3 times and went straight to the address in Pentonville. Mrs. Bedwin was very pleased to see him, and took him straight to Mr. Brownlow in his study. Mr. Grimwig was there too. Mr. Bumble told Mr. Brownlow what a bad boy Oliver was. His parents were criminals. He was never happy with what he had, and he ran away after trying to murder a man who was kind to him. Mr. Brownlow was very upset when he heard this news. Even Mr. Grimwig was not happy to hear it. Mr. Brownlow gave the beadle £5. Then he called Mrs. Bedwin and told her what the beadle said. Mrs. Bedwin said she did not believe it, but Mr. Brownlow told her that nobody must ever say Oliver's name in his house again. The next day, the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates went out as usual. Fagin reminded Oliver that he took care of him when he arrived in London. "Don't be ungrateful," he said. "Don't try to run away." He told Oliver about a boy who tried to run away before. He told the police something about this boy. They found the boy and hanged him. He hoped that something like that would not happen to Oliver. Oliver hoped so too. He was very frightened. Fagin locked him in a room for about a week. After that, he was allowed to walk around in the house, but could not go outside. It was a very dirty house, though it had once been grand. Oliver was very lonely. One afternoon, the Artful Dodger made Oliver clean his shoes. While Oliver was busy, the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates began to talk about their lives as thieves. "Why don't you become one of us?" the Artful Dodger asked Oliver. Oliver said he didn't like it. They laughed at him, and the Artful Dodger offered him some money. Oliver refused to take it. "If you don't steal handkerchiefs and watches," said the Artful Dodger, "somebody else will. You need them as much as anybody else does, so you should take them." Fagin heard this and told Oliver to take notice. Oliver met another man who came to the house. His name was Tom Chitling. He was older than the Artful Dodger, but seemed to think of the younger boy as a leader. Tom Chitling was just out of jail after being there for 2 months. After this, Oliver was never alone. Fagin and the boys played their games, and Fagin told stories about his past. Sometimes these stories were very funny, and Oliver laughed. One cold, wet night, Fagin put on his coat and went out into the dark streets of London. He went to a house near Bethnal Green and knocked on the door. A dog growled at him when he went in, but Bill Sikes told the dog to be quiet. Nancy was there too. "When are you going to break into the house at Chertsey?" asked Fagin. Sikes explained that he was not able to get into the house. His plan was to pay a servant to let him in so that he could steal from it. He tried to make friends with the servants, but he did not succeed. If Sikes could steal things from that house, Fagin would pay him for the things he stole and then sell them to somebody else. Sikes said he needed a small boy to help him. He would get the small boy into the house through a window, and the boy would open the door and let him in. Fagin thought that Oliver could do it, and Sikes and Nancy agreed. Fagin was pleased about this. He wanted Oliver to believe himself to be a thief. Then, thought Fagin, he would be loyal to them. They agreed that Nancy would bring Oliver to Sikes's house the next night. When Fagin returned to his own place, he wanted to speak to Oliver immediately, but Oliver was asleep. "Tomorrow," he said. In the morning, Oliver found a pair of new shoes next to his bed. He didn't know what to think about this. Then Fagin told him he was going to Sikes's house that night. "Do you want to know why you're going there?" he asked. "Yes," replied Oliver. "Can you guess?" asked Fagin. "No," replied Oliver. Fagin was disappointed. "Wait till Bill tells you," he said. He gave Oliver a book to read and warned him about Sikes. "Do as he tells you," he said. "He is a very rough man, so be careful." Fagin went out, and Oliver read the book. It was about criminals and the crimes they did. It was about robberies and murders, and Oliver became more and more afraid. He heard a noise and jumped up. "Who's there?" he said, shaking with fear. It was Nancy. She sat down and began to cry. Then she got up again. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I will take you to Bill Sikes." Oliver thought that he might be able to escape once they were on the street. "I'm ready," he said. Nancy guessed what he was thinking. "Don't try to escape," she said. "You cannot help yourself. I tried to help you, but I couldn't. If you are going to escape, this is not the time." She showed him some marks on her neck and arms. "Don't let them hurt me again," she said. "Please come quietly." When they got to Sikes's house, he showed Oliver a gun. He told Oliver he would shoot him in the head if he did not obey him. They had something to eat, although Oliver was not very hungry. Then Sikes went to bed and told Nancy to wake him at 5 o'clock. Oliver lay down too, but stayed awake for a long time before he fell asleep. When he woke up, they had some breakfast, and Sikes took Oliver outside. He made sure Oliver knew that the gun was still in his pocket. Chapter 6. They went quietly. It was a very cold, gray morning. It was windy, the clouds looked stormy, and it was raining hard. It was dark. There was just enough light to see the pools of water on the road. There were no other people on the streets. Everything was quiet and empty. They walked for several hours, and the day became lighter. They began to see people on the roads and horses pulling carts against the rain and wind. Some of the shops began to open. More and more people came onto the streets as the day grew older. It was still not very light, but it would become no lighter that day. Sikes and Oliver walked to Smithfield, where there was a market. Oliver was amazed by the things he saw and heard there. It was very dirty and smelly and noisy. There were pigs, sheep, cows, horses, and dogs. There were butchers and farmers. There were boys and thieves. The animals made noises, and the men shouted and argued. Oliver had never seen anything like it. Sikes saw some friends and said hello to them, but he did not stop. He kept on walking quickly through the market, dragging Oliver with him. They walked on until they got to Hyde Park. Sikes saw a cart going past them and asked the driver for a ride. They passed through several towns, and then they got off the cart and began to walk again. Oliver wondered where they were going. They came to Hampton and stayed there for a few hours before having lunch in a hotel. They stayed in the hotel all afternoon, and Oliver fell asleep. Sikes bought some beer for a driver who was drinking there and asked for a ride to Halliford. He woke Oliver up. It was dark now, and they got on the cart and drove off into the black night. They rode through Sunbury, then got off the cart and began to walk again. They walked right through Shepperton and on to another town. They came to a bridge over a river. Sikes suddenly turned toward the river, and Oliver was afraid that Sikes was going to drown him in the river. Then he saw an old house that nobody lived in. It was very dark and frightening, but they went into it. They met two men inside the house. The first was Toby, and the second was Barney. They sat in a low, dark room, on some broken chairs and a very old couch. Toby was a large man with red hair, and he was very pleased to see Sikes. Sikes told him who Oliver was. Toby laughed when he heard that Oliver was working for Fagin. Barney brought them all some food. They drank some gin and made Oliver drink some too. Oliver didn't like it, and everybody laughed. Then they slept for a few hours before Toby jumped up. "It's 1:30, he said. "Time to get ready." The men dressed in dark clothes. They got some guns and other things and put them in their pockets. Oliver didn't know what they were doing. Sikes and Toby held on to Oliver, and they went out into the street, leaving Barney behind. It was very, very dark. The air was wet with fog, and Oliver's hair was half frozen in the cold. They walked to a small town called Chertsey. They saw nobody. They came to a house with a wall around it. Toby quickly climbed the wall. Sikes handed Oliver up to him, and he pulled the boy up and over the wall. Sikes was soon over the wall, too. They went quietly toward the house. Suddenly, Oliver realized what was happening. It was a burglary. It might even be murder. he sank down to the ground. "Get up, or I'll blow your head off," whispered Sikes.
"Don't make me steal," cried Oliver. "Let me run away. I will never come to London again. Please let me go."
Sikes pulled out his gun and was ready to shoot him, but Toby stopped him. "You can't do that here," he whispered angrily. He put his hand over Oliver's mouth while Sikes broke open a small window in the house. Then he told Oliver to go in through the window and go to the front door and open it, so that they could all get in. He gave him a light to carry. Sikes lowered Oliver through the window and into the house. Oliver decided he would go in and wake the people up to warn them that there were thieves breaking into the house. He went to the door. Suddenly, Sikes shouted, "Come back!" Oliver dropped his light. Then he saw two men inside the house and heard a loud noise. He fell back against the wall. Sikes shot at the two men, who ran further into the house. Sikes dragged Oliver out of the window. Oliver was bleeding. He felt people carrying him, and then he fainted. On that same very cold, dark night, Mrs. Corney was sitting in her own small room, near her own small fire. She was the matron of the workhouse where Oliver was born. She had a small round table and a small tea set and was drinking some tea by the fire. Mrs. Corney was a widow, but she was feeling very happy with her life. As she was drinking, there was a knock at the door. She was annoyed because she thought it would be a nurse calling her to go to the workhouse for some reason. However, it was Mr. Bumble. He brought her some wine and sat down to have tea with her. He complained about the poor people. He explained to Mrs. Corney that the best thing to do for the poor was to give them things they did not want. Then they would stop coming and asking for more. As they spoke, Mr. Bumble moved his chair around the table until he was sitting very close to Mrs. Corney. He drank his cup of tea, ate the last piece of bread, brushed the crumbs from his clothes, cleaned his mouth with his hand, and kissed Mrs. Corney. "Mr. Bumble!" exclaimed Mrs. Corney. "I will scream!" Mr. Bumble put his arm around her. She did not scream. There was a knock on the door. Mr. Bumble rushed to the other side of the little room. The door opened. "Old Sally is dying," said a nurse. Mrs. Corney was annoyed. "Well, I can't keep her alive, can I?" she said. "No, Mrs. Corney, nobody can do that," said the nurse. "But she says that she must tell you something before she dies." Mrs. Corney had to go. She asked Mr. Bumble to wait until she returned and went out with the nurse. Mr. Bumble walked around the room, looking at everything in it. Then he sat by the fire and waited. Mrs. Corney went with the nurse to a cold room in the workhouse. An old woman lay dying on a bed. Two old women were sitting with her. Old Sally was almost dead. Mrs. Corney waited for her to speak, but old Sally was asleep. As Mrs. Corney was about to leave, Sally suddenly woke. She told the other women to leave. Then she told Mrs. Corney her secret. "In this room, I once nursed a very pretty young lady. She came to the workhouse with bleeding feet and had a baby the next day. Then she died. I robbed her. I stole the only thing she had. It was gold. Before she died, she took it from around her neck and asked me to look after it. She said that her baby could use it to discover her name one day." "Who was the baby?" asked Mrs. Corney. "They called him Oliver," said old Sally. "He grew to look just like his mother." Before she could say any more, old Sally died. Chapter 7. I Saw the Shadow of a Woman. Fagin sat in his room thinking. He was not happy. The Artful Dodger, Charlie Bates, and Tom Chitling were playing cards. Charlie Bates kept looking at Tom's cards, and the Artful Dodger kept winning all the games and the money. Finally, Tom decided he would not play any more. Charlie Bates began to tease him about bet, and soon the boys were fighting. Tom Chitling tried to hit Charlie Bates. Charlie jumped out of the way, and Tom hit Fagin by accident. Just then, there was a knock on the door. It was Toby. He seemed happy and asked for some food and drink before he would tell his story. When he finished eating, he asked Fagin how Sikes was, but Fagin could not tell him. He had not seen Sikes. Toby became afraid.
"Where are Sikes and the boy?" shouted Fagin. "Where are they hiding? Why didn't they come here?"
He hit the floor with his stick.
"What happened?"
"They heard us and chased us with guns," answered Toby. "They shot the boy. We tried to save him, but we had to leave him in a ditch, or they would have caught all of us. I don't know if he is alive or dead."
Fagin screamed. He put his hands in his hair and rushed out of the room and out of the house. A horse almost knocked him over because he did not look where he was going. He went to Saffron Hill, which was a place with lots of dirty shops. These shops sold all the things that thieves stole. Fagin went to a shop owned by Mr. Lively. Mr. Lively had not seen Sikes or the boy. Fagin went to the hotel. Sikes was not there. Barney was not there either. Fagin found the landlord.
"Is he here?"
he asked. "Do you mean Monks?" asked the landlord.
"Hush, yes,"
replied Fagin.
"He'll be here soon," said the landlord, "if you wait 10 minutes.
But Fagin didn't want to wait.
"Tell him he must come to me tonight or tomorrow," he said.
He went out and took a carriage to Sikes's home. Sikes was not there, but Nancy was. Nancy was not happy to see him. She did not know where Bill Sikes and the boy were.
"I hope the boy is dead," she said, "so that we cannot hurt him any more."
Fagin was surprised.
"If Sikes comes back here and does not bring me the boy, you should murder him yourself before I do," he exclaimed.
It was Nancy's turn to be surprised.
"That boy is worth hundreds of pounds to me," said Fagin, "and there is someone who can—"
He stopped. He had said more than he wanted to say. He hoped Nancy had not heard. He asked her about it. He thought she had not understood him. He left her there and returned home. Monks was there waiting for him. Fagin allowed him to come in, and they talked together very quietly for about 15 minutes.
"You should have kept him here," said Monks. "You could have made him into a little thief. You've done it many times before." "It was not that easy," replied Fagin. "He was not afraid. I could not make him like the other boys. I sent him out with the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates, but that did not work. You know that. We don't want that to happen again."
"No, we don't, but I'm pleased that it happened," said Monks. "I was looking for him, and that was how I found him. I don't want him dead, but I want him out of the way." "What's that?"
"What?"
said Fagin. "I thought I saw the shadow of a woman," whispered Monks.
They rushed out of the room and searched the house. They didn't find anyone.
"I must have imagined it,"
said Monks. Mr. Bumble waited for Mrs. Corney to return. He waited a long time. He counted all the spoons. He counted them again. He looked at the furniture. Then he began to look inside the drawers. He found a small locked box. He could hear that there was money inside it.
"I'll do it,"
he said. When Mrs. Corney returned, she needed a drink. Mr. Bumble told her that Mr. Snout, the manager of the workhouse, was very ill.
"He will die soon," he said. "They will need a new manager."
He smiled very happily.
"The new manager and the matron could share their lives," he said.
Mrs. Corney agreed. They decided to marry. Mrs. Corney told him that old Sally died. Mr. Bumble said he would visit Mr. Sowerberry on his way home. Mr. and Mrs. Sowerberry were out for tea. Noah Claypole was looking after the shop. He was sitting at the table with Charlotte eating oysters. Mr. Bumble saw them. Then he heard Noah tell Charlotte to kiss him. He rushed into the room. He was very angry with both of them.
"Kissing?"
he exclaimed.
"How do you dare?"
He told Noah to get back to work.
"Tell Mr. Sowerberry that there is a dead woman at the workhouse. He should come tomorrow morning."
Sikes and Toby ran from the house as quickly as they could. They carried Oliver with them. Men were shouting, and dogs were barking. They saw 3 men climbing the wall to chase them. They were afraid. They put Oliver down in a ditch. Sikes put his coat over him, and then he and Toby ran away. The 3 men came a short way into the field and stopped. They were afraid too. Mr. Giles was the head servant for the old lady who lived in the house. Mr. Brittles was his helper. The 3rd man was a traveler who was sleeping in a shed. Mr. Giles had called him to help them chase the burglars. They looked around for the burglars. They could see something, but didn't know what it was. They were very frightened and decided to go back to the house. Oliver lay in the ditch in the dark. As morning came, it began to rain. Oliver did not feel it. It fell on him as he lay unconscious and helpless in the ditch. At last he woke up. He cried with pain. His left arm hurt, and it was bleeding. He got up and began to walk. He did not know where he was going. He was only half awake. He came to a road. It began to rain so hard that it woke him up. He saw a house and went toward it. He could hardly walk. He recognized the house. It was the house they tried to burgle. He wanted to run away, but he couldn't. His legs would not move. He fell against the door. Just then, Giles, Brittles, and the traveler were having a cup of tea and telling the other servants about the burglary. The cook and the maid were frightened by the story. Then they heard a noise at the door, and this frightened them even more. Perhaps the robbers had returned. The 3 men and the 2 women all went to the door together. Brittles opened it. When they saw Oliver, Mr. Giles pulled him into the house and began to shout. "Here he is, miss! I shot him! He's hurt, miss! I caught one of the robbers, miss!" A young girl spoke from the stairs. "Giles," she whispered. "I'm here, miss. Don't worry, miss. He didn't hurt me, miss," said Giles.
"Hush,"
said the young lady.
"You'll frighten my aunt. Is he very hurt?"
"Yes," shouted Brittles. "I think he will die. Come and look at him." The young lady shook her head.
"No, I don't want to see him," she said. "Perhaps later."
She went to speak to her aunt. Then she told the servants to take the robber to Giles's room and look after him. She told Brittles to get a police officer and a doctor. Giles very carefully took Oliver upstairs to his own room and put him on a bed. Chapter 8. The house was empty. The young lady and her aunt sat down for breakfast. The young lady was about 17 years old, and she was very pretty. Her name was Rose. Giles brought the food to them. Suddenly, a very fat man arrived in a carriage. He jumped out and ran to the front door. He came in and talked to the 2 ladies at breakfast. "My dear Mrs. Maylie," he exclaimed, "you are lucky to be alive. They might have shot you." This was the doctor, whose name was Mr. Losberne. He asked the 2 ladies if they were hurt. They told him they were not hurt, but that Giles had shot one of the burglars. They wanted him to examine the burglar. He went to look at Oliver. He stayed with him for a long time. When he returned to the ladies, he asked if they had seen the burglar. They hadn't. He said that they need not be afraid of him. He took them to the room where Oliver lay asleep. The 2 ladies expected to see a rough, dirty man, and were surprised that the burglar was only a little boy. Giles had not told them he had shot a boy. When they looked at him, they could not believe that Oliver was a burglar. "He is too young to be a criminal," said Rose. A police officer was waiting to talk to him, but they wanted to save Oliver from the police and from jail. They asked the doctor what to do. The doctor was a good man. He thought about how he could help his 2 friends. "Let him rest now," he said, "and I will talk to him when he is a little stronger." That evening he talked to Oliver. Oliver told him his story. The doctor believed that Oliver was telling the truth. He decided to help him. He called Giles and Brittles. "Are you sure that this is the boy you shot?" he asked angrily. Giles and Brittles were worried. They looked at each other and at the police officer. They didn't answer. The doctor asked them again. They still did not answer. They did not dare. Then they heard a noise at the door. "It's the police from London," said Brittles. "We sent for them this morning." Brittles was right. 2 men came into the house. Mr. Blathers was large and about 50 years old. Mr. Duff was younger and taller, and he had red hair. Mr. Losberne told them the story of the burglary. The 2 police officers talked to each other. "These burglars were from the city," they said. "People who live near here are not clever enough to do that." Then they asked about the boy. "Don't worry about him," said the doctor. "One of the servants thought he might have been in the burglary, but he wasn't. It's nonsense." He took the police officers to see the window that the burglars had broken. and the room where Giles shot the boy. Then he took them to the garden and to the wall so that they could look at everything. After that, the police officers talked to Giles and Brittles. They told their story 6 times, and each time it was different. Then the officers talked to each other for a long time. Mr. Losberne was anxious. He thought that the police officers would not believe Oliver. They would take him to the judge, and Oliver would be put in jail. Mrs. Maylie and Rose were anxious too. The police officers wanted to talk to Oliver immediately, but Mrs. Maylie and Rose gave them a drink and spoke to them. The police officers told them about another burglary. The robbers were never caught. The 2 officers disagreed about who did it. Mr. Blathers said it was Conky Chickweed, and Mr. Duff thought it was Family Pet. Then they told a funny story about Conky Chickweed. He once told everybody that someone stole his money. Everybody felt sorry for him and gave him money. Then they found out that he took the money himself. The 2 police officers from London thought this was a very funny story and laughed at it. While the 2 officers were drinking and talking, the doctor was busy in another room. When he returned, he took the 2 officers to see Oliver. Oliver looked worse. Mr. Losberne told them that this boy was hurt in an accident. "He came here for help," he said, "but the servants thought he was a burglar and did not look after him." "Are you sure it was the boy who broke into the house?" Mr. Blathers asked Giles. "I can't be sure now," answered Giles. "It was very dark, and there was a lot of noise. I thought it was him, but now I think it was not." The doctor told them they should let Oliver rest and talk to Brittles in the next room. Brittles told them a different story about the shooting. He did not know if it was the same boy. The 2 officers went to look at the guns that Giles and Brittles had used. The guns were not loaded. Everybody was surprised except the doctor. Giles was very happy. "I didn't shoot anyone!" he exclaimed. The 2 police officers from London decided that Oliver could not be the boy who broke into the house. As they left, they were still arguing about Conky Chickweed and Family Pet. Oliver was sick for many weeks. His arm was broken, and he had a bad fever from being out in the rain on the night of the burglary. As he improved, he was very thankful to the 2 ladies and the doctor who looked after him. They promised that they would keep him with them, and Oliver was very happy. The doctor promised that he would take him to see Mr. Brownlow when he was strong enough. This made Oliver even happier. He wanted to tell Mr. Brownlow what happened to the books and the money. He did not want Mr. Brownlow to think he was a thief. One day, Mr. Losberne said Oliver was well enough. He put Oliver in a carriage and started out on the road to London. When they arrived at Mr. Brownlow's house, it was empty. Nobody was there. They asked the neighbor. He told them that Mr. Brownlow and his housekeeper, as well as Mr. Brownlow's friend, had gone to the West Indies 6 weeks ago. Oliver wanted to go to the bookshop, but Mr. Losberne decided to go home. Oliver was very sad. Mr. Brownlow might never know that he was not a thief. For the next 3 months, Mrs. Maylie and Rose lived in a house in the hills. They took Oliver with them. There he grew much stronger. He had a teacher every day and learned about gardens and animals. It was spring. He picked flowers for his 2 friends. He read books. He listened to the birds. He heard Rose playing the piano and singing. He thought it was beautiful. He went for walks. He ate fresh food. It was a wonderful time for him, as well as for the 2 ladies. Chapter 9. The Man Shook His Fist. Spring became summer. The country became even more beautiful, and Oliver became healthy and happy. He had never been so healthy and happy before. He loved his 2 lady friends, and they loved him. They enjoyed going for walks in the fields. One evening they walked further than usual. It was such a lovely night. Rose played the piano when they were back at the house, but then she began to cry. She felt ill and went to bed. She had a fever, and Mrs. Maylie was very worried. The next morning she was worse. Mrs. Maylie and Oliver were very sad. They both cried. Mrs. Maylie gave Oliver a letter for Mr. Losberne. She gave him some money and told him to take the letter to the village. There he should pay somebody to take the letter to Mr. Losberne as quickly as possible. She had another letter which was addressed to Harry Maylie, but she did not want to send that letter yet. Oliver took the money and the letter for Mr. Losberne and hurried to the village. He went to the hotel and found the postboy. It took a while, but at last a horse was on its way with the letter. Oliver was leaving the hotel when he knocked into a tall man in a long coat. "What's this?" cried the tall man.
"I'm sorry, sir," said Oliver. "I was in a hurry and didn't see you."
"Why are you here? I should have told them to get rid of you," said the man.
He was very angry. Oliver apologized again, but the tall man shook his fist at him. He came toward Oliver, and Oliver was afraid. Who was this strange, angry man? Then the man fell on the ground. Oliver thought he was mad. He went into the hotel and got somebody to help him. He watched as they carried him into the hotel. When Oliver got home, he soon forgot about the strange man. Rose was worse. A doctor from the village said she was very sick, and he did not expect her to live. The people in the house did not sleep well for the next few nights. They were all worried about Rose. Mr. Losberne received the letter and came to see Rose as quickly as he could. He agreed with the other doctor. Rose was very sick, and he thought she would die. The days were beautiful, but nobody was happy. One morning, Mr. Losberne told them that Rose was asleep. He did not know if she would wake up again. If she did, she would recover. A few hours later, he came to them again. "She is awake," he said happily. "She will live." Mrs. Maylay and Oliver were very pleased to hear the news. Oliver went out into the fields to find flowers to put in Rose's room. As he was going back to the house, he saw a horse and carriage coming quickly along the road to the house. Giles was in the carriage with Harry Maylay. They stopped and asked about Rose. They were glad when Oliver told them she was better. Oliver could see that Harry was Mrs. Maylay's son. Harry was in love with Rose, but Mrs. Maylay said he should not marry her. There was a mark against her name that would cause him trouble. If they had children, it would cause them trouble too.
"It is not her fault, I know," said Mrs. Maylay, "but she knows it will hurt you. She does not want to hurt you and cause trouble. You can ask her to marry you when she is better, but she will refuse."
The next day, everybody was much happier. Oliver went to get some more flowers, and Harry came with him. The days went by, and Rose got better and better. Oliver began to study his books again. Once evening, he was sitting in his room reading, and he fell asleep. He dreamed that he saw Fagin. He woke up with a fright. There was Fagin, looking at him through the window of his room. With him was the strange man he had knocked into at the hotel. "That's him," said Fagin. "Of course it is," said the other man. "I could never make a mistake about that." They saw Oliver look at them and quickly left the window. Oliver jumped up from his chair. He ran to the window. He saw the tall man jump over a hedge, and Fagin went through a nearby hole in the hedge. He shouted for help.
"I saw Fagin,"
he said when Harry and Giles arrived.
"He was looking at me through the window, and I saw the strange man I knocked into at the hotel. They were together."
They began to search for the two men. They looked everywhere, but they couldn't find them. Oliver showed them where he saw the tall man jump over the hedge and where Fagin had gone through a hole. There were no footprints in the wet ground. They looked in the ditches. They looked behind all the trees near the house. They ran through the garden. There was nothing to see. Giles went to the village. He described Fagin and the tall man to the people there. Nobody had seen them. They searched until it was dark. They searched again the next day. They even went to the next village to ask about them there. They found nothing. "It must have been a dream, Oliver," said Harry.
"No, I'm sure I saw them,"
replied Oliver. A few days later, Harry Maylay talked to Rose. He told her that he loved her and wanted to marry her. She loved him too, although she did not tell him that, but she refused to marry him.
"You will be an important man one day," she said, "and I cannot be your wife. I cannot have your children. People will remember that nobody knows who my mother and father are. It will stop you from being everything you could be. I do not want to stop you. I would be very unhappy. You would be very unhappy too. That's why I can never marry you."
Harry tried to argue with her, but she would not change her mind. "If I was already less fortunate and no one cared about me," he said, "could you marry me then?" Rose did not want to answer this question. Harry said he would ask her again later. If she still refused then, he would not try to change her mind. Mr. Losberne was leaving the next day, and Harry decided to go with him. First, he made Oliver promise to write to him every 2 weeks. He wanted to know how Rose and his mother were. These letters would be a secret, he said. Oliver was very happy to help Harry. He promised to write. Everybody came to see the carriage leave. Harry and the doctor were in the carriage waving goodbye. They all watched the carriage move away from the house. They watched for a long time. Upstairs in her room, Rose sat at the window. She watched longer than anyone else. Chapter 10. The fire was out. Mr. Bumble was not happy. He was no longer the beadle. He was the manager of the workhouse. He received more money, but he did not have a nice uniform which everybody recognized. He missed his uniform, but this was not the main reason for his unhappiness. Mr. Bumble married Mrs. Corney, but it was not a happy marriage. Mr. Bumble sat in a chair near the fireplace. It was summer, so the fire was out. He was thinking about his situation.
"It is just 2 months," he said to himself. "Everything has changed. Why did I do it? I sold myself for some spoons, a few pieces of furniture, and about 20 pounds in money."
He sighed. Then he sighed again.
"I sold myself too cheap," he said.
He didn't know that Mrs. Bumble was behind him. She heard him. "Cheap?" she said. "You would have been expensive at any price." Mr. Bumble turned and saw his wife.
"Mrs. Bumble,"
he said. He looked at her angrily. When he was the beadle, he looked at people in the workhouse in that way. They were afraid of him then. He expected that Mrs. Bumble would also be afraid. She was not. She laughed. Mr. Bumble was surprised. "Are you going to sit there all day?" asked Mrs. Bumble.
"I will sit here as long as I like," replied Mr. Bumble. "That is my right."
"Your right," said Mrs. Bumble. "What is your right?"
"It is the right of a man to give orders," said Mr. Bumble.
"And what is the right of a woman?" asked Mrs. Bumble.
"To obey,"
said Mr. Bumble. He was angry now and began to shout.
"If your late husband had taught you that, he might still be alive now. I wish he were."
Mrs. Bumble knew that she had to win this fight. She sat down and began to cry. She cried loudly, but Mr. Bumble did not feel sorry for her. People in the workhouse often cried. He never felt sorry for them. In fact, he enjoyed it. It made him realize how important he was.
"Crying is good for you," he said. "It washes your face and makes you feel better. You can cry as much as you like."
He picked up his hat and walked toward the door. Mrs. Bumble realized that crying would not work. Her next plan was to fight. She knocked Mr. Bumble's hat off his head. She took hold of him by the neck. She hit him. Then she scratched his face and pulled his hair. She pushed him onto a chair. "Tell me about your right again," she said. "Get up and get out and do something useful," she shouted at him. Mr. Bumble picked up his hat and looked at the door. "Are you going?" she asked.
Yes, I am, my dear,"
he said as he rushed out. He walked around the workhouse. He tried to look as important as he could, but it was very difficult. He didn't have a uniform. His face was scratched, and he could not forget the fight with his wife. Then his situation became worse. He heard some women in the workhouse talking and tried to stop them. His wife heard him. She told him to leave them alone. The women laughed at him as he left. He felt very bad. He didn't know what to do. He went out into the street. He walked up one street and down another until he began to feel a little better. He began to feel thirsty. He came to a hotel and looked through the window. There was only one man in it. It began to rain, so he stepped into the hotel and ordered a drink. The man in the hotel looked at him, and he looked at the man. He was a tall man and wore a long coat. Mr. Bumble thought he came from far away. The man spoke to him.
"I have seen you before," he said, "but you were wearing a beadle's uniform then. Aren't you the beadle?"
Mr. Bumble was surprised.
"I was the beadle," he said, "but now I am the manager of the workhouse."
He began to feel important again.
"Good," said the stranger. "I came here today to look for you, and here you are.
You have found me instead. You can help me." He bought a drink for Mr. Bumble and gave him £2. Mr. Bumble was surprised again. "How can I help you?" he asked. "About 12 years ago, a boy was born in this town. He worked for a coffin maker but ran away to London." "Yes," said Mr. Bumble. "You mean Oliver Twist. I remember him. He was a bad boy." "I don't want to hear about him," said the man. "I want to know about the woman who helped at the birth. Where is she?" "She died last winter," answered Mr. Bumble. The man looked disappointed. "Well, it doesn't matter," he said. He got up to leave. "Wait," said Mr. Bumble. "I know the woman who was with her when she died. I know the old lady told this woman a secret. I don't know what the secret is." The stranger was very interested. "How can I talk to this woman?" asked the stranger. "Only through me," replied Mr. Bumble. The stranger told him when and where to meet him the next night. He wrote the address on a piece of paper. He was very excited. "What is your name?" asked Mr. Bumble. "Monks," replied the stranger as he walked quickly away. The next evening, it was raining when Mr. and Mrs. Bumble walked onto the street. They were dressed in very old clothes. Nobody would recognize them. They walked through the streets toward the river. It was one of the poorest parts of London. It was very dirty. Mr. Bumble stopped to look at a piece of paper he had in his hand. They walked on. They stopped again. "It should be here somewhere," said Mr. Bumble. A man shouted at them from the upstairs window of a very old and dirty building. It was Monks. "Remember what I told you," said Mrs. Bumble. "Say as little as possible. Let me talk to him. You are a fool." Monks opened the door. There was a loud noise of thunder, and rain began to fall very heavily. They went in and followed Monks up some stairs to a large empty room. At one end of the room, there were 3 old chairs and a table. They sat down there. "Is this the woman you spoke about yesterday?" Monks asked Mr. Bumble. Mr. Bumble did not get a chance to answer. His wife answered for him. "Yes, I am," she said. "I was with the old woman when she died and she told me her secret." "Then the first question is, what did she tell you?" said Monks. "No," said Mrs. Bumble. "That's the second question. The first question is, what is it worth?" "It may be worth nothing. It may be worth £20, said Monks. "I won't know until I hear what it is." "Give me £25, replied Mrs. Bumble, "and I will tell you." Monks was annoyed and tried to argue with her, but he finally agreed. He gave her the money. She told him about old Sally's death. She told him that Oliver's mother gave old Sally something before she died to give to Oliver when he was older. "She said she kept it for herself," said Mrs. Bumble. "What was it? Where is it? Did she tell you anything else?" asked Monks. "She said no more," answered Mrs. Bumble. "She died." "She must have told you more," shouted Monks. "No, she didn't," said Mrs. Bumble. "But in her hand I found a piece of paper. It told me where it was. I went there and got it." "Where is it now?" asked Monks quickly. "Here," said Mrs. Bumble. She took out a small bag. In it was a gold locket with 2 pieces of hair in it. There was also a gold wedding ring with a date and the word Agnes written on it. "Is that all?" asked Monks. "Yes," replied Mrs. Bumble. "Is it what you wanted?" "Yes," answered Monks. "What will you do with it?" asked Mrs. Bumble. "Can it be used against me?" "Never," said Monks. He opened a trap door in the floor. They could see the cold, dark river under them. Monks took the little bag, put a heavy stone in it, and dropped it in the river. Chapter 11. How Did You Find Me? Bill Sikes lay on a bed. He was sick. The room was small and poorly furnished. His white dog sat near him. It was thin and hungry. So was Sikes. Nancy sat near a window, mending his coat. Sikes was angry. "Help me get onto a chair," he ordered Nancy. "I feel as weak as water." Nancy helped him. He fell. He blamed Nancy and struck her. She reminded him that she had looked after him while he was sick. He shouted at her. She was very tired and sick too. She fainted. Sikes didn't know what to do. He shouted at her again, but this didn't help. Fagin arrived with the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates, and they helped him put Nancy on the bed. Then Sikes wanted to know why they were there. They had brought him some food. Sikes was thankful, but he wanted to know why Fagin had not come earlier. "I was away," said Fagin. "I couldn't help it." "Well, I must have some money tonight," said Sikes. Fagin said he had none with him. He promised to send the Artful Dodger with some. Sikes didn't trust the Artful Dodger, and said they should give the money to Nancy to bring to him. Fagin went home with the two boys, and Nancy and Sikes went back to sleep on the bed. When Fagin got home, he told the two boys to go out. He asked Nancy to wait while he went to another room to get some money. While she was waiting, Monks arrived and talked to Fagin for a while. Nancy listened at the door. Monks left, and Fagin gave Nancy some money. She went out and ran from the house. She was upset by what she heard at the door. She ran one way and then another. Finally, she ran back to Sikes and gave him the money. Sikes spent most of the next day eating and drinking. He did not take much notice of Nancy, who was still very upset. That night, however, he took more notice. He began to think that Nancy was sick, or that she was planning to do something. He questioned her, but she told him that everything was all right. She put something in his drink to make him sleep. As soon as he was asleep, she kissed him and ran from the room. She ran along the streets to West London. This was where the rich people lived. She went to a hotel near Hyde Park and asked to see Miss Maylie. At first, the hotel staff refused to let her in, but at last someone agreed to give Miss Maylie a message. They brought Nancy to a small room and asked her to wait. Rose came into the room and was very surprised to see Nancy. She had never seen her before, but was very friendly to her. Nancy told her what she had heard. She told Rose that she was the girl who had dragged Oliver away from Mr. Brownlow. Then she told her about Monks. Monks gave Fagin some money for getting Oliver back, and would give him more if Oliver became a thief. She heard Monks tell Fagin that Oliver was his younger brother. "Then Monks laughed," said Nancy. "He said that it is very strange that Oliver is in your house. He said you would love to know who he is." "How did you find me?" asked Rose. "Monks told Fagin where you were staying," replied Nancy. Rose was very surprised and wanted to help Nancy, but Nancy wanted to go back to Sikes. She tried to explain that she could not leave Sikes, but Rose could not understand this. "How will I find you if I need you?" asked Rose. "Promise me that you will come by yourself or with one other person. Promise me that no one will watch me or follow me." Rose promised. "Every Sunday night I will walk on London Bridge between 11 o'clock and 12 o'clock, said Nancy, "if I am alive." Then she left, and Rose sat down to think about what Nancy had said. She thought about it all night and hardly slept. She decided not to tell the doctor, who was with them, because he would be too angry. He would try to do things immediately, without thinking about it first. She thought about asking Harry to come, but she decided that he might not want to see her. She was still thinking about this the next morning when Oliver came into her room. He was very excited and wanted to tell her something important. Oliver was walking in the street with Giles when he saw Mr. Brownlow. He was so surprised that he didn't know what to do. He wrote down the address of the house, and now he wanted to go there and see him. Rose knew what to do. She called a carriage and took Oliver to the house immediately. She left him in the carriage and went to speak to Mr. Brownlow. Mr. Grimwig was there too. She told them about Oliver's life since they last saw him. Mr. Brownlow was very pleased to hear about Oliver. He rushed out to the carriage and came back in with him. He called Mrs. Bedwin. They were all very, very happy to see one another again. Mr. Brownlow agreed to meet Mr. Losberne the next day at the hotel, and Rose and Oliver returned home. Rose was right about the doctor. The next morning, when they told him Nancy's story, he was very angry. He put on his hat and wanted to go and tell Blathers and Duff immediately. They persuaded him not to do that. "We can't do that," said Mr. Brownlow. "We need to act carefully. If we don't, we will never find out about Oliver's parents. They will never tell us anything. We need to find Monks and make him talk." "We should follow Nancy then," said the doctor. "I promised her I wouldn't do that," said Rose. They decided that they needed to talk to Nancy and agreed to wait until Sunday night, when she would be walking on the bridge. The doctor thought it would be difficult to wait for 5 days. Mr. Brownlow wanted to invite his friend Grimwig to help them. The doctor wanted to invite Harry Maylie. Everyone agreed. They decided to keep their plan secret. They would not even tell Oliver. On the same night that Nancy visited Rose, 2 people were hurrying toward London. One was an ugly young man with long legs who carried a small bundle. The other was a young woman who carried a heavy bundle on her back. Noah Claypole and Charlotte had stolen money from Mr. Sowerberry, the undertaker, and were escaping to London. Noah walked much faster than Charlotte because of his long legs and his light bundle. He waited for her and told her to hurry. Charlotte wanted to stay at the first hotel they saw. Noah decided that it was too dangerous. He would rather stay further into the city. "They won't find us so easily then," he said. He made Charlotte carry her heavy bundle through the narrow streets of London. They came to a very dirty hotel. It was the same hotel that Fagin went to when he was looking for monks. Noah asked for a room. While they waited, he and Charlotte had a drink. Noah talked to Charlotte about his plans. He thought he could be a good thief. There were many things to steal in London, he thought. He just needed to meet the right people to help him. He didn't know that a man was listening to every word he said. This man was Fagin. Fagin soon decided that he could use Noah and Charlotte. He spoke to them. Noah sent Charlotte upstairs with the bundles, while he talked to Fagin. He wanted some criminal work. "Not too hard," he said, "and not too dangerous." Fagin thought about it. "How about old ladies?" he said. "I don't know," said Noah. "Don't they scream and sometimes scratch you?" Fagin thought about it again. "You can come and meet my friend," he said. "He can teach you how to knock over children and take their money from them." Noah was pleased with this, and they arranged to meet again the next day. He told Fagin his name was Morris Bolter. Chapter 12. I Think I Know Him. Fagin began to teach Noah Claypole, also known as Morris Bolter, about how to be a criminal. He explained that it was important to look after one another. "The best way to look after yourself," he said, "is to look after your friends. That's how it works." This was a new idea for Mr. Bolter. He was very interested, and Fagin told him more about his work. "Yesterday," he said, "the police caught my best helper. They said he tried to steal a handkerchief, and they found a silver snuff box in his pocket. It was his own box, but they didn't believe him. He is worth 50 snuff boxes. I would give that many to have him back. Now he will be lagged." "What does that mean?" asked Mr. Bolter. Fagin was about to explain when Charlie Bates came in with news about the Artful Dodger. "They have found the owner of the snuff box," he said. "He'll be lagged. He'll be sent to Australia." Now Mr. Bolter understood what lagged meant. Fagin and Charlie Bates continued to talk about the Artful Dodger. They remembered all the wonderful things he did. They were very pleased with his work. "We have to see what happens to him in the court today," said Fagin. They decided to send Mr. Bolter to the court. They dressed him up in some old clothes and took him to the court. Charlie Bates waited outside. Mr. Bolter went into the court. The Artful Dodger put on a very good show. He made the people in the court laugh by acting like a gentleman. He told them that he was late for a meeting and would lose business. He said he would sue the court. He refused to talk to the witnesses or to say anything about himself. Afterward, they put him in a cell, and Noah went back to where he had left Charlie Bates. Together, they returned to Fagin to tell him what had happened. Nancy felt very strange about her visit to Rose Maylie. She knew that it was the right thing to do, and this made her feel good. At the same time, she knew that she was acting against her best friends, and this made her feel bad. On Sunday night, Fagin was visiting Sykes. They were talking to each other when Nancy put on her coat and bonnet and went to the door. She wanted to keep her promise to Rose and walk on London Bridge. "Where are you going?" asked Sykes. "Not far," replied Nancy. "That's no answer," said Sykes. "Where are you going?" "I said not far." "And I said where?" "I don't know," said the girl. "Then I do," said the man. "You are going nowhere. Sit down." "I am not well," said Nancy. "I just want some air."
"Then put your head out the window," said Sikes.
He went to the door and locked it. He pulled her bonnet and coat off her and told her to sit down and be quiet. Nancy begged him to let her out. She cried. She shouted. She asked Fagin to help her. She sat on the floor near the door. Sikes pulled her into another room and held her until she stopped fighting.
"She must be mad,"
Sikes told Fagin. Fagin thought about it as he walked home. He decided that Nancy had made a new friend and wanted to see him. This made Fagin very interested. He wanted to get rid of Sikes. If Nancy had a new friend, Fagin wanted to meet him as soon as possible. Perhaps he could persuade Nancy to poison Sikes, and the new friend could replace him. He was very pleased with this idea. The next morning, Fagin sent Charlotte out with the other girls so he could talk to Noah alone. He wanted Noah to follow Nancy and find out who her new friend was. "Is it dangerous?" asked Noah. "Not at all," said Fagin. He agreed to give Noah £1. The next Sunday, Sikes was out all night, and Nancy walked to London Bridge. An ugly young man with long legs followed her and watched her every move. He kept out of sight on the dark streets, and she did not notice him. When she came to the bridge, she walked across it, looking at the other people walking there. She then turned around and walked back. It was a very dark night, and not many people were on the bridge at that time. Nobody noticed the woman who looked at them or the ugly man who watched her all the time. It was midnight when a carriage stopped near the bridge. A young lady and a gray-haired gentleman got out of it and walked onto the bridge. As soon as Nancy saw them, she went to them, and the young man with the long legs followed closely. He was very close to them when Nancy told her visitors to meet her down the steps near the river. The young man with the long legs walked past them and went down the steps. He hid near the bottom and waited. At last, Nancy, Rose, and Mr. Brownlow came down the steps. They stopped near the young man's hiding place and began to talk.
"Why have you brought us here?" asked the gentleman.
"We could have talked on the bridge, where there is some light. This is a dark hole." "I told you that I was afraid up there," said Nancy. "I don't know why I am afraid, but I feel safer here."
"You were not here last Sunday,"
began Mr. Brownlow. "I couldn't," said Nancy. "I was locked up by the man I talked about before. It is very difficult for me to get away from him. When I came to visit you in the hotel, I could only do it after I put something in his drink to make him sleep. He always wants to know where I am going, but he is not home tonight."
"This young lady," said Mr. Brownlow, "has told me about your visit. I believe that you are telling the truth. We want to talk to the man called Monks. If we can't find out what we want from him, we will need to talk to the man that Oliver calls Fagin."
"I cannot tell you about Fagin," exclaimed Nancy. "He is a very bad man and has done terrible things to me. But he has also been my only helper. I cannot tell you about him."
"Then we must talk to Monks,"
replied Mr. Brownlow. He and Rose promised that Monks would never know that Nancy had helped them find him. Nancy then told them where they could find Monks and described him to them. "He is tall and strong and always looks around when he is walking. His eyes are very deep set. His face is dark. His eyes and hair are dark too. High up on his neck, he has a wide red mark like a burn." Mr. Brownlow was surprised to hear this. "I think I know him," he said. Rose was surprised too.
"You have been very helpful," said Mr. Brownlow. "How can we help you?"
"You cannot help me," replied Nancy. "It is too late. I am beyond all hope."
"I can take you away from here and give you a new life and a new place," said Mr. Brownlow. "Nobody will ever know what happens to you. You never need to go back to them."
"I hate my life, but I cannot leave it," said Nancy sadly. Rose wanted to give her some money, but she would not take it. "I did not do it for money," she said. "Let me have something you are wearing. No, not your ring. Just give me your handkerchief. Thank you." Rose and Mr. Brownlow went up the stairs to the bridge. Nancy sat down and cried. After a while she got up and went up the stairs too. Noah stayed in his hiding place for a few minutes before he dared to come out. He went up the stairs carefully, and then ran to Fagin's house as fast as he could. Chapter 13. Her Name is Always Remembered. Fagin was very angry when he heard the story that Noah told him. He was so angry that his whole body shook. He sent for Sykes and told him. Sykes was just as angry as Fagin. He was especially angry when Noah told him that Nancy had put something in his drink to make him sleep. He tried to rush out of Fagin's house, but the door was locked. Fagin would not unlock it.
"Listen to me first,"
he said.
"Do what you have to do, but be smart, Bill. Don't be too rough. Try to keep safe."
He unlocked the door and Sykes rushed out. He went straight to his room. Nancy was asleep. He woke her up and pulled her out of the bed. He told her that he knew about her visit to London Bridge. She cried. She begged him not to hurt her. He took his gun out of his pocket. He did not shoot her because he knew that people would hear the shot. He hit her face with the gun. She fell. Her face was bleeding. She used Rose Maylie's handkerchief to try and stop the blood. Sykes got a heavy piece of wood and struck her with it. Nancy moaned. He struck her again and again until she lay dead on the floor. He put a cloth over her body. There was a lot of blood. Even the dog had blood on its feet. He washed them. He burned the piece of wood in the fire. He took the dog and left the room, locking the door behind him. He didn't know what to do. He went this way and that way. Sometimes he ran. At other times, he walked very slowly. Then he ran again. He went around in circles. All the time he thought he could see Nancy's dead body and her eyes following him. Finally, at the end of a long day, he went to a village called Hatfield. There he went into a hotel, where he ate and drank and almost fell asleep in a chair. A man at the hotel noticed a stain on Sykes' hat. It was Nancy's blood. Sykes rushed out and ran down the street. He came to a post office and heard people talk about the terrible murder of a woman in London. He left Hatfield. He found a shed and tried to sleep there. The wind moaned through the trees. It sounded just like Nancy's moan when she died. He could not sleep. Then he heard men shouting. He rushed out of the shed. There was a fire, and men were trying to put it out. Sykes helped them. He worked harder than any of them. When the fire was out, he sat with the men and had breakfast with them. They began to talk about the murder. He hurried away again. He still didn't know what to do. He decided to go back to London. "I'll get some money from Fagin and go to France," he thought. He walked back toward the city. He realized that people might recognize his dog. He decided to kill it, but the dog ran away. Mr. Brownlow went to the hotel that Nancy told him about. He found Monks there and spoke to him. Monks was angry, but he was also afraid, so he agreed to talk in Mr. Brownlow's house. Mr. Brownlow and Monks knew each other. Mr. Brownlow was the best friend of Monks' father, and was going to marry his friend's sister, but she got sick and died. Monks' father and mother did not like each other and did not live together. Monks lived with his mother, who taught him to hate his father. His father became friends with a man who had 2 daughters. One of these daughters was 19 years old. Her name was Agnes. The other daughter was only 3 years old. Agnes fell in love with Monk's father. Then a rich member of his family died and left Monk's father a lot of money. Very soon after that, Monk's father died, and all the money went to Monk's mother. "However," said Mr. Brownlow, "before your father died, he had told me his plan. He was going to give his wife some money and take the rest of the money and go to another country. He planned to take Agnes with him. He gave me a beautiful picture of her. When your father died, I tried to find his friend, but they were gone. When I first met Oliver, I saw that he looked exactly like the picture. Monk's mother died, and Monks went to live in the West Indies. Mr. Brownlow went there to look for him, but discovered that Monks was back in England. Mr. Brownlow returned to England and continued his search. Your father wrote a will," continued Mr. Brownlow, "but your mother burned it. The will said that if Agnes had a baby, he or she should receive most of the money. You tried to destroy all the evidence that Oliver was that child. However, your mother kept some letters that Agnes wrote to your father." Monks had to agree that all this was true. That afternoon, the police took Fagin to jail. They came to his house. Toby was there with Charlie Bates, but they escaped. Noah was there too, and he tried to hide in an empty barrel, but the police saw his long legs sticking out of the top. They took him to jail too. Toby went to a secret hiding place in an old building on a muddy island in the river. It was the dirtiest part of London. There he met some other friends. They talked about Fagin. They knew that he would hang. As they were thinking about this in silence, a white dog jumped in the window. It was Sykes's dog. It could not find anybody at the other hiding places, so it came to this one. Toby and his friends could not understand why the dog was alone. Where was Sykes? They gave the dog something to drink, and it went to sleep in a corner of the room. Some time later, somebody knocked on the door. At first, they thought it was Charlie Bates, but it was Sykes. He came in. He was shaking. He sat down. They all looked at each other. They heard another knock on the door. This time, it was Charlie Bates. He came in and was surprised to see Sykes. He was very angry with Sykes and began to shout, and then he hit him. Sykes tried to stop him, but Charlie Bates shouted louder and louder. Sykes put him in a different room and locked the door, but Charlie kept on shouting. "Help, murderer! He's here!" he shouted from the window. Soon they could hear people coming across the old wooden bridge to the house. They heard another knock on the door. Then the people started to break the door. Sykes looked out of the window and saw that there were a lot of people outside. He got a long rope and went up onto the roof of the building. His plan was to lower himself to the river, where there was only mud, as the tide was out. The people saw him on the roof and shouted. Then the door broke, and all the people rushed to the other side of the house. Sykes put the rope around himself to go down to the mud. He fell. The rope slipped to his neck. It was not long enough to reach the ground, and Sykes died. His dog was on the roof with him. It jumped down onto Sykes's shoulders, but then fell onto the ground and broke its neck. 2 days after this, Oliver was in a carriage with Mrs. Maylie and Rose, Mrs. Bedwin, and the good doctor, Mr. Losberne. Mr. Brownlow was in another carriage behind them. They were going toward the workhouse where Oliver was born. Oliver saw the house where Dick lived and said he wanted to make Dick happy. Rose agreed. They went past Mr. Sowerberry's shop and the workhouse. They came to a hotel and went in. Mr. Grimwig was there. Dinner was ready for them. After dinner, the gentlemen had a meeting. Finally, they came into the room where Oliver and Rose were. They brought Monks with them. Oliver was surprised and afraid when he recognized him. Mr. Brownlow told Oliver that Monks was his half-brother. Their father was Edwin Leaford, who was Mr. Brownlow's good friend. Oliver's mother was Agnes Fleming, the beautiful daughter of Edwin's friend. Agnes's father passed away soon after Agnes died. Somebody in the village looked after Agnes's sister. A lady saw her and liked her. She took her home and brought her up. That lady was Miss Maylie, and Agnes's sister was none other than Rose. This meant that Rose was in fact Oliver's aunt. A few hours later, Harry Maylie arrived. He told Rose that he had decided to become an ordinary person and work in the church. This meant that Rose could marry him, and she agreed to be his wife. The only sad news that day was that Dick had died. Fagin sat in a cell waiting to be hanged. It was dark and cold in the jail, but he did not seem to care. He thought about all the other people who had sat in this cell waiting to be hanged. He thought about his boys. Some of them had sat here too. It was the night before the hanging. Mr. Brownlow and Oliver came to visit him. They wanted to know about the letters that Monks had given him. Oliver was very frightened, but he was brave. Fagin whispered to him and told him where the letters were. Mr. Brownlow and Oliver left. The next day, Fagin was hanged. 3 months later, Harry and Rose were married. Mrs. Maylie went to live with them. Giles and Brittles lived there, too. Oliver agreed to let Monks have half the money left by their father. Monks went to live in America, where he soon wasted his money and died in jail. Mr. Brownlow made Oliver his son and went to live near Harry and Rose. Mr. Losberne stayed back in Chertsey for a while, but at last he came to live there too. He became friendly with Mr. Grimwig, and they often met up and talked. The police let Noah go free because he told them more about Fagin. Mr. and Mrs. Bumble lost their jobs at the workhouse, and finally ended up living in the workhouse because they became poor. Charlie Bates decided that being a criminal was a bad idea. He left London and found work on farms. In the church where Harry Maylie worked, there is still a sign with the name Agnes on it. There is no coffin there, but her name is always remembered. Playlet, Oliver Twist. This part of the story tells us what happened when Sikes and Toby tried to make Oliver help them burgle a house. In the garden, near a small window in a wall, Oliver is kneeling on the ground. Sikes and Toby are standing beside him.
No, no! Don't make me steal! Let me go!
Get up or I will blow your head off!
Don't be a fool, Sikes. You can't do that here. People will hear us.
Toby puts his hand over Oliver's mouth while Sikes breaks open the small window. They push Oliver through the window.
Now go to the front door and open it.
Oliver starts to go to the front door.
Come back. I heard something.
Oliver turns around. Giles and Brittles appear at the door. Giles has a gun and shoots Oliver. He and Brittles are very afraid and run into the house. Oliver holds on to his left arm. Sikes grabs him and drags him back out of the window. Sikes and Toby run away, carrying Oliver.
They're chasing us! Run!
The two men drop Oliver and run away. It is the next morning, inside the house. Mrs. Maylie and Rose are sitting at a table having breakfast. Giles is waiting on them. On another part of the stage, Oliver is lying in a bed asleep.
Giles, please pour some tea.
Were you afraid last night, Aunt?
No, Giles is a very good servant. I am sure he will keep us safe.
Yes, that's true, but the gun made a loud noise. Could I have some milk, please, Giles?
A fat man rushes into the room. It is Mr. Losberne, the doctor.
My dear Miss Maylie, dear Rose, are you all right? You are lucky to be alive. They might have shot you.
We are not hurt, Doctor.
But Giles shot one of the terrible burglars, and he is hurt. We thought he ran away, but he came back to the house this morning. We would like you to examine him.
Yes, of course, Rose. Where is he?
Giles, please take Mr. Losberne to see the burglar you shot.
Of course, miss. This way, please, Doctor.
He leads the doctor to Oliver. Giles returns to the breakfast table while the doctor bends over Oliver and looks at his arm. There is a knock at the door. Giles goes off stage to open it. He returns to the breakfast room.
I have asked Brittles to get the police, madam.
Good. We don't want to keep him here any longer than necessary.
Please tell us when they arrive.
Very good, miss.
He goes off stage. The doctor enters.
Have you seen this burglar, ladies?
No, we haven't. I am sure that he is not a nice man to look at.
I think you might be surprised. Please come and see him.
Very well. We will come with you.
They get up and move across to Oliver's bed. He is still asleep.
Why, he is only a boy.
Yes, he is very small. Is he all right, Doctor?
He is badly hurt, but I think he will be all right.
He can't be a burglar. He is much too young. We must not let the police take him. He is too small and sick to go to jail.
Don't worry, ladies. I will save him.
Giles enters with Brittles.
Who shot this boy?
I did, sir. He was trying to burgle the house. I shot him.
Giles, you didn't tell us it was only a boy.
Are you sure this is the boy you shot? Did you see him properly in the dark?
Giles and Brittles look at each other. They are not sure.
Well, was it the same boy?
There is another knock on the door. Giles goes to answer it.
I'm not sure. It was dark. It was Giles who saw him.
Giles returns with two police officers.
These police officers are from London. This is Mr. Blathers, and this is Mr. Duff.
Welcome, officers. I think you should talk to Giles and Brittles first. They saw everything.
Very good idea, madam. Please come with me, gentlemen.
He leads Giles and Brittles to another part of the stage. Duff goes with them. Mrs. Maylie and Rose continue to look at Oliver. They clean his face and hands and comb his hair while the police officers speak with Giles and Brittles. Mr. Losberne goes off stage.
Now, gentlemen, what happened?
Well, sir, I heard a noise. I went to see what it was. Brittles came with me. I took a gun. Then Brittles saw the boy and said, "Shoot him, he's a burglar."
No, that's not how it happened. You saw the boy and told me to shoot him, but you had the gun, so you shot him.
Who saw him first?
He did.
He did.
This is very strange. You don't agree with each other. We cannot arrest him unless you can agree. Perhaps we should look at the gun.
Mr. Losberne enters, carrying the gun. He is doing something to it.
Officers, I think this is the gun that they used.
Is this your gun?
Yes. It is not loaded. This gun did not shoot anybody.
Really?
That's very strange. I'm sure I loaded it.
No, I loaded it.
I need to speak to Mrs. Maylie.
They all go back to where Mrs. Maylie and Rose are still looking after Oliver. Blathers is carrying the gun.
Mrs. Maylie, I think there has been a mistake. This boy was not one of the burglars. Your servants cannot agree with each other, and now we discover that the gun was not loaded. I agree. This boy was not one of the burglars. We will go back to London. Goodbye.
The two policemen leave. Mr. Losberne, Mrs. Maylie, and Rose are happy. Giles and Brittles look puzzled. Mr. Sowerberry called his wife to look at the boy. She thought Oliver was small and useless and sent him to the kitchen. The undertaker's dog had left some food in its bowl, and this became Oliver's dinner. When he had eaten it all, Mrs. Sowerberry took him to his bed, which was in a room full of coffins. Chapter 2. It was a long way. Oliver felt very afraid and alone when he got into his bed in the room of coffins. He wished that his bed was a coffin and he could sleep forever. Then he would never be hungry again. He got into his bed and slept. In the morning he woke up because someone was kicking the door and shouting. He got up to open the door. The shouter was Noah Claypole, a boy who was a few years older than Oliver and much bigger. He made fun of Oliver and hit him for being lazy. Noah was a charity boy. This meant that he was very poor and went to a charity school for poor children. Everybody made fun of Noah because his parents were poor. Oliver was even poorer. Noah was happy to have somebody poor to tease. He told Oliver what to do, and did nothing himself. He laughed at Oliver all the time. His friend Charlotte, who worked in the kitchen, laughed at Oliver too. Oliver had to help make the coffins. When he had been there about a month, Mr. Sowerberry began to take him along to funerals. Poor people in England often starved to death in those days, and Oliver saw some really terrible things. Some of the people lived in dirty houses, with dirty clothes and no food. There was no medicine for people who had no money, so they just got sick and died. One man went out to beg for food for his starving wife. Begging was against the law, and he was put in jail. When he came out, his wife was very sick, and a few days later she died. Oliver did not like the funerals. Noah Claypole was annoyed because Mr. Sowerberry took Oliver to the funerals. He began to tease Oliver more and more. One day, he said some bad things about Oliver's mother. Oliver got very angry and hit Noah. He was not afraid, even though Noah was much bigger than he. Noah fell down and began to cry. He shouted for help. Charlotte came into the room and saw Noah on the ground. She screamed and hit Oliver with her fist. Mrs. Sowerberry came in and saw Charlotte hitting Oliver. "He was trying to murder Noah!" shouted Charlotte. Mrs. Sowerberry held on to Oliver so that food. They decided to give them less food so that they would leave the workhouse and find jobs. Many people died of hunger, but the board was happy. Giving the people less food saved money. Having fewer people in the workhouse saved even more money. The boys in the workhouse had their meals in a large stone hall. They each had a small bowl and a spoon. They brought their bowl to the front of the hall, and the master filled it with gruel. They brought their bowls back to the table and sat down to eat the gruel. The bowls never had to be washed because the boys ate the gruel until there was not one drop left. Then they licked their fingers to get any gruel that might be on them. They also licked their spoons clean, but they were still hungry. After 3 months, one of the bigger boys said to the others that he was so hungry he might eat one of the smaller boys. They were all afraid of him and decided to ask the master for more gruel. Who would dare to ask? They chose Oliver. The next day, after they ate their gruel and were still hungry, Oliver went to the master.
"Please, sir, I want some more,"
he said. The master could not believe his ears. Oliver had to say it again. The master hit him and called for the beadle. The beadle went to the board to tell them what had happened. Oliver Twist had asked for more. The board could not believe their ears either. The beadle had to say it again. The board decided that Oliver was too much trouble. He was sure to end up in jail. They put him in a cold, dark room by himself and would not allow the other boys to talk to him. At mealtimes, they brought Oliver to the dining hall and hit him there in front of the other boys. This would show them what happened to boys who asked for more. The board put a notice on the gate of the workhouse. The notice said that they would give £5 to anyone who would take Oliver as an apprentice for a job. The first person to ask about Oliver was a chimney sweep who owed his landlord £5. Being a chimney sweep was a dangerous job, and many boys died. The board agreed to give the sweep £3, and he agreed to take Oliver. The board took Oliver to the judge, who had to sign the contract. The contract would last for 7 years. The judge saw that Oliver was very afraid of the chimney sweep. He refused to sign the papers. He ordered the board to take Oliver back to the workhouse and look after him. The next person to ask for Oliver was the undertaker, whose name was Mr. Sowerberry. This time the board gave Oliver to the undertaker on trial. They did not need the judge's agreement for that. The beadle took Oliver to the undertaker's house. Chapter 1. It was not a good beginning. In the 1830s, every English town had a workhouse. This was a place where poor people lived. They had no jobs, so the government gave them a place to work and sleep and food to eat. These were not nice places. The government did not want people to become lazy, so they made the workhouses as uncomfortable as possible. They gave the poor people uniforms to wear, as they did to prisoners. The food was terrible. The rooms were in bad condition. Many people got sick and died there. Nobody wanted to live there. Oliver was born in a workhouse. Nobody knew who his father was, and his mother died as soon as Oliver was born. It was not a good beginning. Nobody knew Oliver's mother's name. Nobody even knew where she came from. Somebody found her lying in the street the day before Oliver's birth and brought her to the workhouse. They knew that she came from far away because her feet were bleeding after her long walk. After Oliver was born, the doctor put on his hat and went home to have dinner. "Don't call me if the boy is sick," he told the nurse. "He probably will be sick, but just give him some gruel to eat." The nurse wrapped Oliver in a piece of cloth. Oliver cried. He cried loudly, but he should have cried even louder. Oliver spent the first 9 years of his life with Mrs. Mann. The government paid Mrs. Mann to look after children like Oliver. She looked after about 20 or 30 children like him. She knew exactly what the children needed, but she also knew exactly what she needed. As a result, she spent most of the money on herself. The children were always hungry and sometimes they starved to death. Sometimes one would fall in the fire while Mrs. Mann was not looking or die of cold in the winter. Somehow, Oliver stayed alive. On his 9th birthday, Oliver was small, thin, and pale. He and 2 other boys told Mrs. Mann that they were hungry. Mrs. Mann said they were not hungry. She hit them and locked all three of them in the cellar. This was their punishment for complaining. When Mrs. Mann looked out of the window, she was surprised to see the beadle at the gate, trying to get in. The beadle was an officer from the government. He thought he was an important officer. He was very fat, but he had a beautiful uniform, which made him feel even more important. When Mrs. Mann saw him, she quickly told her helper to get the three boys out of the cellar and clean their faces and hands. She pretended she was very pleased to see the beadle, whose name was Mr. Bumble, and gave him a glass of gin to drink. Mr. Bumble told Mrs. Mann that he was going to take Oliver away because he was now 9 years old.
"We have never been able to find out anything about his father or mother," he said. "We don't even know their names. Oliver will work in the workhouse and earn his gruel."
Mrs. Mann was surprised that nobody knew who Oliver's parents were and wondered how he got a name.
"I gave it to him," said the beadle. "I made it up myself."
Mrs. Mann brought Oliver to the beadle.
"Would you like to come with me, Oliver?"
asked Mr. Bumble. Oliver would like to go anywhere with anyone if it meant getting away from Mrs. Mann, but he didn't say that. He knew he had to pretend that he loved Mrs. Mann, so he cried. It was not difficult to cry because he was so hungry and sad. Mr. Bumble let him out of the house, and poor Oliver cried even more because he really was sad to leave the other children. They were his only friends. When they arrived at the workhouse, the beadle discovered that the board of the workhouse was meeting. They wanted to see Oliver and speak to him. Oliver did not know what the board was and didn't dare to ask. He was afraid. Mr. Bumble hit him with his stick to hurry him up, and took him to the boardroom. There Oliver found 8 or 10 fat gentlemen sitting around a large table. One of the chairs was higher than the others, and the man in it was fatter than the others.
"What's your name, boy?"
asked the fat gentleman. Oliver was frightened and spoke very quietly. Mr. Bumble hit him again, and this made him cry, although it was not a very hard hit. The fat man told him that he was an orphan.
"What's that?"
asked Oliver.
"It means you have no father or mother," said the fat man. "It means that other people like us are paying for your food and clothes. I hope you are thankful."
"Why are you crying?" asked one of the other gentlemen. Oliver could not answer.
"We are going to educate you and teach you to work," said the fat man. "Tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, you will begin to pick oakum."
Oliver didn't know what this was, but he soon found out. He had to pull old ropes apart. People in jail or in workhouses often did this hard and boring work. That night, he cried in his hard bed until he fell asleep. The board, meanwhile, decided that people in workhouses were getting too much food. They thought too many people wanted to be in the workhouses to get food. Charlotte could hit him more easily. Then Noah got up and started to hit Oliver too. Mrs. Sowerberry held on to Oliver with one hand and scratched his face with the other. They dragged Oliver to the cellar and locked him in. Mr. Sowerberry was not home, and they didn't know what to do next. Oliver kicked at the cellar door, and Mrs. Sowerberry began to cry and ordered Noah to run to Mr. Bumble and ask him to come. Noah ran as fast as he could. Mr. Bumble was talking to a member of the board. Noah told them that Oliver tried to murder him, then Charlotte, and then Mrs. Sowerberry. He could hardly breathe, and he held different parts of his body to show how hurt he was.
"He said he wanted to kill the master too,"
gasped Noah.
"I always said that he would end up in jail," said the member of the board. "Perhaps they'll even hang him."
He told Mr. Bumble to flog Oliver.
"Make sure you do a good job,"
he said, as Noah and Mr. Bumble hurried toward the undertaker's house. Mr. Bumble spoke to Oliver through the cellar door.
"Do you know who this is?"
he asked.
"Yes,"
said Oliver.
"Aren't you afraid?"
asked the beadle.
"No,"
said Oliver, and began to kick the door again. Mr. Bumble was very surprised. People were always afraid of him. Mrs. Sowerberry thought Oliver must be mad.
"No," said the beadle. "It is meat. You gave him too much good food, and now he thinks he is someone. I think we should keep him in the cellar for a few days. We will take him out and flog him when he is quieter."
Mr. Sowerberry came home and heard what happened. He dragged Oliver out of the cellar and hit him. Oliver told him that Noah had said bad things about his mother. Mrs. Sowerberry said that Noah only told the truth. Oliver called Mrs. Sowerberry a liar, and she started to cry. Mr. Sowerberry hit Oliver again and locked him in the kitchen, where he stayed for the rest of the day until bedtime. Oliver did not sleep that night. He wrapped his clothes in a piece of cloth. He had a shirt and 2 pairs of stockings. He also had a piece of bread and 1 penny that Mr. Sowerberry gave him a long time ago. That was all he had. Very early the next morning, he looked outside. It was just beginning to get light. He picked up his small bundle, opened the door, and went out. He looked to the right and to the left. He began to walk. He walked quickly. He came to a path. This led him past Mrs. Mann's house. As he passed the house, he saw one of his old friends, Dick, in the garden. Nobody else was up yet, and the 2 friends said goodbye. Dick told Oliver that the doctor said he would not live much longer.